For the second session here now, we have Dr. Terry Krupa. Dr. Krupa comes to us from Canada, Queen's University.
Beautiful.
And at Queen's University, she is a professor and associate director for the School of Rehabilitation Therapy. Dr. Krupa is a research. She focuses certainly with looking at the addictions and looking at substance use recovery. People's integration back into community is going to be a challenge. And really looking forward to Dr. Krupa's presentation here, as that's her one of her primary areas of research, is looking at development and initiatives, looking at how to get those people back into community-based interaction. So Dr. Krupa has authored 3 books and has published over 30 peer-reviewed articles. Welcome, Dr. Krupa.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Like other people here, I'd like to thank the committee, the organizing committee, and Dr. Wilkins for inviting me. Like Dr. Ndado, I also have a student, a former student, who's working here, and it's delightful for me to see her in such a dynamic and supportive environment. When I was asked to talk on time use today, I wondered what I would talk about with this audience. And am I correct in assuming that the audience doesn't know very much about time use and its applications? So, like everybody else, I have no conflicts of interest. I will say my one conflict of interest was that in coming here, I got to fly Qatar Air, and that was a wonderful experience. So what I thought might be most useful for you in the time that I have, I wanted to provide you with an overview that would introduce you to time use as a recognized indicator of health and well-being. I'm going to spend a bit of time considering the links between time use, substance use, misuse, and addictions. And then we're going to consider some potential applications of time use to the treatment of substance misuse and addictions. And you'll see a lot of links to what I'm talking about to other speakers, and I hope I can make some of those connections. I do want to highlight that this is a relatively new perspective that may have a potential to contribute to a complex problem. I think one of the things that we're learning here, as people are talking about different perspectives on wellness, that this is a complex issue and that our interventions are complex and that they're multi-element. And so maybe this is one element that you might want to see added to your programs or services. Okay, so first let's think about what time use is. It's an interdisciplinary field of study and practice that's concerned with how people actually allocate their time and the relationship of that allocation to health and well-being. The focus of time use is actually on what we do. So it's on our activity engagement, our patterns of activity. And we tend in the field not to look at extremes, like just off days or off times, but we look at things that are typical days, typical patterns and routines to understand how people allocate their time. And the diagram that I've got on the side is actually a common kind of diagram you see in time use scholarship. There actually is a fair bit of scholarship related to time use, activity allocation, and its relationships to health and well-being in the general population. And so theoretically, here are sort of, in a really simple way, the 3 links. The belief is that through what we do, we experience recognized elements of health and well-being. Okay, so what we get in terms of health and well-being is through what we do. And you'll see the kind of petals on the outside here highlight different kinds of health and well-being benefits, many of which we've already heard here. Now, there are many more than this. They're kind of clustered. I'm not very good at PowerPoint, and that's a template that was available, so I used it. You might think there are some missing. So for instance, we've been hearing a lot about spiritual issues and the relationship to health and well-being. Well, actually in the scholarship, spiritual might be connected to purpose and meaning. And if we go to that scholarship, for instance, there's a lot written on the difference between meaning of life and meaning in life and how those things relate to what we do and how we relate in our world. The second point theoretically about this is that an activity can have multiple health and well-being benefits. Now, what's important to realize about this is, we have a lot of conversation about exercise, for instance. Well, really, the point about exercise is just an activity. The point about exercise is it's going to give us the physical activity that is associated with the health and well-being. I don't have to get that physical activity through exercise. I could get it through, I think, Mary, you commented, gardening. And I do garden. And not only do I get physical benefits from gardening, but my neighbors stop and admire my garden, so I belong to my neighborhood. Maybe I sell my flowers and I get a financial benefit from it. So here's an example of an activity where I could have multiple benefits. And that is pretty well what happens through the course of our day. The third point, theoretically, is that the structure and organization of activities actually influences our health and well-being. So it's not just the activity and what we experience in it, it's actually how it's actually organized in our day and how it's organized with other people in society. We'll talk a little bit more about that as I go along. Now, one of the things I want you to know is that this is actually a recognized public health approach. And so from a public health perspective, it's understood that time use can promote health and well-being. I said it was an interdisciplinary field. And the trouble in the health world, of course, is we talk about interdisciplinary. I'd say I'm an occupational therapist. You'll say you're a psychiatrist, you're a physiotherapist. In this field, we really are interdisciplinary. So when I go to health promotion and time use, I'm going to be talking to people who are sociologists, human geographers, epidemiologists, urban planners, a wide range of people. Most prominently, the idea has been applied at a societal and community level. And in fact, many nations regularly conduct population-level time use surveys for social policy and planning purposes. So for instance, if I want to know how Canadians spend their time and how that relates to health and well-being, Canada actually collects that data fairly routinely, or used to before our previous government. I know you're interested in what might apply here, and I do believe that Qatar actually conducted a time use survey of the population in about 2012 and 2013. Now, what would they do with that? Well, what happens from a public health perspective is they look at time use and sort out things that can help us understand how people's health might be affected. So for instance, urban planners will be interested in time spent in commuting from work to home, because we know actually that a lot of time in a car or traveling adds to work life and is problematic in terms of health. I highlighted as well that a lot of nations look between the link between activity patterns and social adjustment of their youth, because youth at risk is a big concern internationally. What it means from a practical point of view for you individually, I would say, if your nation is actually conducting time use surveys, they are probably producing information that will be valuable to you. And there's an example on the right-hand side of the kind of graph that we might get detailing how people spend their time. This is for adults employed with children. Okay, in terms of time use and well-being, it's a recognizer indicator on many national indexes of well-being. And so, for example, in the Canadian Index of Well-being, you'll see that time use is actually featured as an indicator. Another thing is I can go to that website and I have all kinds of tools and materials that are available to me to understand time use and the way that it's applied. So for instance, time use probably featured into one of the criteria that help judge Canadian citizens as one of the 10 happiest people in the world. Okay, when we look at it applied to individuals, it's a relatively more recent phenomena. It's most frequently applied to people who are in transition phases of life, where we're likely to have marked disruption of activity patterns and routines. So for instance, if I wanted to say I was going to do this talk back in Canada, seniors in aging groups would invite me right away, because seniors understand, and we understand that the aging process, this is a big issue, right? In other areas where we see it applied, it's been applied to people where we're looking at helping them live meaningful and productive lives while managing persistent or intermittent health life conditions. So for instance, individuals living with chronic pain, health conditions associated with fatigue, or even states of deteriorating health, because of course people's relationships to their activities in the world change. Most prevalent or perhaps relevant to substance use is the next. It's applied greatly to highly stigmatized and marginalized conditions, such as serious mental illness, homelessness, substance use, and severe disability. Probably because these are populations that are either on the fringes or completely on the margins of social structures that help us organize our time for health and well-being. When we think about how we collect this in a practical way, it's typically done through the use of some sort of a survey, things like time use diaries, activity logs, and we were hearing about technology. Well, now we'll see apps that are actually being developed. It's typically collected as a 24-hour clock, as an organizing feature of daily activity. And here's the important thing, is it focuses on the activities that are actually performed, and this is an important piece. So any of you have worked with clients where you say, well, what did you do with your day, or what do you do? And then they list things, okay? I always give the example, if somebody says, well, what do you like to do, Terry? And I'll say, well, actually, I like to fish. And the truth is, I actually do like to fish. I haven't actually picked up a fishing rod for over 1.5 years. Okay, so even though I see fishing as part of my identity and what I do, I'm not actually doing it, right? So we need to see what people do. The other is, we see the activity allocation in context, and we're able to distinguish between the typical and the average, between the unusual. Usually, these are organized in broad categories of self-care, productivity, leisure, socialization, and rest. Again, with discussion points. This is a very simple time use log, 24 hours. So people would talk over a course of a typical day, what they did from 12 noon to 12:30, what the activity is, maybe where they did it so we can see where they move in the community, who they did it with, that kind of thing. The important thing here is then the interpretation or the evaluation of time use, and reflections are carried out in the context of a helping relationship. So this isn't something we just leave with people. The idea is that we sit and we speak with them and reflect on this in relation to what we know. So we might look at what people actually do, right? The amount of time spent on activities, the temporal patterns. Often, particularly people, for instance, who are not working in typically organized jobs, what you find is a mix-up of day and night, and I would imagine that's often a problem with people with substance use issues. We look at social interactions and connections during the activity, the location, the meaning of the activity for the individual, other activity patterns such as how much control they have, balance issues, choice. And for instance, in the context of substance use intervention, we would specifically say, show me where substances enter this day. Take me through how and where substances are featuring. So evaluating time use patterns recognizes, for instance, that activities, even though I said that we get our health and well-being benefits through activity, it also recognizes that activities are not inherently positive or negative, right? So we have been speaking, for example, at this conference, as if social networks and family and friends are all positive. And you know, there's a huge body of literature to support that when those relationships are positive, they have huge health benefits for people. And there's a scholarship behind all of these benefits, right, that links exactly what is happening in terms of health benefits. But not all social networks are actually causative, right? And not all social networks are health promoting. And in fact, I would argue that to sustain substance use, you probably have some social networks that are not very healthy, right? Even though they may be bringing you things like belonging, they may be bringing you friendship, they are also bringing you other things. The other thing that we interpret is it's not an individual activity that you look at. So we might look and say, well, this is a problem, the person's unemployed. But in time use, we're less concerned about distinct activities, and we're more interested in actual activity patterns. So, and interpreting them as a whole. So for example, this is just a study that was related to time use, looking at deviant behaviors such as substance use among adolescents. Okay. And the studies found that deviant behaviors such as substance use were associated with high allocation of time to discretionary activities among young people when they were done with peers. Okay, so they have discretionary activity, they're not in school, let's say, it's done with peers, but not when it's done in conventional structured environments. So if it's in the family environment, if it's in a community center, it's not. The other thing they find, though, is that the high association between activities and family time and well-being are there, but it's not clear that time with family actually protects people from the negative influences of activities done with peers outside of those environments. In terms of actual practice, this is a practice that is not expert-driven. Even though it's done with an expert, it must be collaborative. And here's the thing is, I can't tell people how to live their life. Right? I can't engineer their life, and I don't know best on how they should live their life. In this process, in doing this activity, what we hope is that it raises the individual's personal awareness of their activity patterns and their relationship to well-being. It will raise the awareness of activity patterns that might be associated with compromised well-being, right? So this is the nature of the conversation with people. It will consider the relationship between specific health conditions and people's daily life activities. It will consider how the activity patterns might be changed to improve health and well-being. And here's the other thing, is this sounds really easy. If I could say, well, why don't you just not do that? But in fact, if this is part of people's typical activity patterns, it is not easy for them to change, right? And so one of the things we want to do is recognize how they can be supported to ensure they have the capacity and the resources for this change. Specifically applied to time use in just the next 5 minutes or so, I want to highlight that there's very little research in this area. Most of the scholarship is descriptive as best. I understand, and I've seen some of the data that's being collected here that I think could contribute in this facility that could contribute to this area. And so we have few empirical studies and published examples. Theoretically, though, the kind of benefits in practice could be this, is that it helps practitioners to see substance use as it's actually embedded across daily life activities. It helps you identify the social context and conditions of substance use across time. Like some of our previous speakers, it's a strengths-based model. So when I look at people's activities, I don't see them as substance users. I see them as mothers and fathers and students and workers and other things, right, that are strengths. And the other is it may have the potential to be accepted by individuals because it's non-pathologizing and it's based on a collaborative approach. I actually use the approach and have done research with it with people with serious mental illness, and I can tell you the other thing is families love this approach. Once families understand the nature of the illness of their child, for instance, or their family members, one of the things they ask right away is, what can I expect of people? What should they be doing? Why are they not doing anything, right? And so this allays some of those concerns. It can be applied whether you use an abstinence, harm reduction, or modification of substance use behaviors, if that's what's driving your vision of your program. And if you're using it to think about then how we might affect changes in time use, there's a whole range of things that actually can be negotiated with individuals. So for instance, you could look at the addition of new activities to replace substance-using activities. You could look to changes in temporal patterns that may actually take people away from the presence of substances. You could keep time use allocations to activities as they are, but change the conditions or context to reduce the pressure for substance using. And you could also introduce and support highly valued activities that are associated with health and well-being, but that are inconsistent with substance use, right? So that you're using the pattern to push people away or negotiate their way away from substance use. So the last thing I just want to highlight before I wrap up, if this is going to be something that you implement, I wanted to highlight the knowledge that practitioners require in order to do this and do it well. First thing is, practitioners who apply this have to have a good understanding of how these dimensions on the right are actually linked to health and well-being. The only way that we can speak to people about these things with any authority is to actually have the knowledge to tell them about what we know about the connection between belonging and health and well-being, or caring for the self and health and well-being. We have to have knowledge about the way specific activities and activity patterns are likely to influence health and well-being. And I'm going to highlight two examples for this in the substance use area. In one of my research studies, I was looking at disability in workplaces. I do a lot of employment research. And I was working with employers, so organizations. And one employer we were talking to about, what's the most prevalent disability they have. It was interesting. It was an auto manufacturing plant. A large company. And the fellow running it said to me, well, Terry, the highest claims we have in terms of disability claims, the highest absenteeism we have, and the highest problems we have that are disability related on this job in the manufacturing plant are related to substance use. That's the issue. Okay. And the employer was very aware that the job is actually putting people at high risk for substance use. Now, when you look at this, it seems a bit odd because, in fact, this job actually gives people social connections. They're good paying jobs, so financially people are getting benefits. It gives people social status, okay? Here's the thing. It doesn't matter where all of those things are in place. In this job, it is repetitive. There is little autonomy. People cannot move out of environments. And basically, in terms of things like skill and growth and autonomy, they don't have that. And that seems to be the feature that is driving them to substance use or related to substance use. Now, you might think, okay, well, that makes sense. Now, I moved to another study, and I was thinking about one of the last presentations we had where we learned about university life. And I've done some substance use, intervention substance use research in three university environments in Canada. You are obviously aware that in North America we have a crisis of alcohol use among post-secondary students. The level of use and the problems associated with this have just gone through the roof. And in this intervention research, one of the things we did, it was quite participatory. So I sat down with students using this kind of approach to understand sort of how does substance use actually enter the life of a student. Here's one of the things they said to me. Terry, what you have to understand is the life of a student is boring. Okay? And I said, help me understand that, all right? And they said, well, you'll see that in our patterns, our substance use goes up, let's say, after exam periods, after really intense periods. I can come out of an entire month where I barely leave my room. I'm reading things that are of no interest to me, even though they're challenging, right? They're quite different than the manufacturing plant. I don't see people. I have no freedom of choice. It's basically, they don't use those words, but that's the nature of the conversation. Now, it was interesting to me, they said, we tell people we're going out with our friends, but we're going out to drink, and we're going out to drink heavily. That is the activity they're doing. in relation to this. So again, two very different activities, and yet both of them sort of merging to the same kind of pattern. The third thing there is the experience of addiction and how it's likely to interact with these dimensions of well-being. One of the things I want to highlight here, because it's come up, is that if we're going to work in this, we have to understand the experience of activities that people with addictions have. Now, I think it was Dr. Jera yesterday who used the word that people's experiences are hijacked. And this is true. But you know, this is not unique to substance use. If I go back to any of the health conditions where I would apply this, people's experiences of activities have been distorted. So whether it's through pain, whether it's through anxiety, whether it's through mobility disability, their experience has been distorted. But as the practitioner, I need to understand what it is. One of the examples we have, and I think it might have been Dr. Nunes, was talking about cocaine and euphoria. Okay? So one of the issues I have as an occupational therapist, for instance, is that I know of no activity that can match the euphoria of cocaine. Okay? Now, that's not true. My son was in New Zealand, and he called me and he said, "Mom, yesterday I went sky jumping. I jumped out of a plane." He was good enough to call me the day after he did this. And the way he explained it, I thought, well, there it is. That's what people who use substances have to do. They have to be sky jumpers and sit on the back of people, because that's the only way they're going to get the euphoria. But one of the things we have to realize is that our activity patterns are not just based on hedonic pleasure. They're based on a range of things that connect with us. So there are things like the values that I place on things, the things that have meaning to me that may be different than just pure hedonic pleasure. Last thing is we have to recognize how to enable the capacities and resources of individuals to affect positive change. So, I said if people are going to change the behavior, they may not have the skills to do it. Then, if you say, don't hang out with those friends, now it means they have to make new ones, right? So in summary, what I tried to highlight is that time use is a social psychological construct that refers to how people allocate time to activities and conditions. I'm using this term very specifically. This is not a psychosocial intervention. It's a social psychological intervention. Time use patterns are associated with health and well-being in the general population. We've extended that practice to health conditions and disability to promote health and wellness. To substance use, it's relatively recent, but it seems to be growing and have promise. But certainly we need more work, both in practice and in research.
Certainly on time for a few questions. Thank you, Dr. Krupa. Anybody on the floor have a question for Dr. Krupa? We have a couple of minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Thank you.
I was struck, Terry, by what students do, as someone who's taught for a number of years, what students do when they're not in class or when they're bored. But in teaching my corporate wellness class, we let students talk about their personal wellness because it's a way to let them get into the game, so to speak. And one of the things they tell me, and I'm wondering about addiction from some of you neurologists, they tell me that they become addicted to Adderall, or they start becoming addicted to substances through Adderall or through Ritalin or drugs like that maybe they were given when they were in the second grade or something, and they just keep on filling those prescriptions. Is that a problem, or is it just something that helps them get through exam time? Or someone tell me, because there is a huge alcohol problem, but this is the second kind of problem.
One of the things I'll just say is, there is a relationship between what people use and how people use and what they do. So for instance, we also know that among students there's a particular use of amphetamines, anything that will bring them up to perform better. But even on university campuses, et cetera, there's a difference between what students use based on what programs of study they're in, right? So for instance, business students start to mirror what we believe, what appears to be happening, is they start to mirror the patterns of what a business person would use. So students on our campus are more likely, their business are more likely to use cocaine. If you're an engineering student, you will be a heavy beer drinker. And beer drinking also has huge gender implications in our nation. So again, you can look at the substance in terms of what are they using, or you can say it is embedded in something where people are being organized towards certain types of use.
Thank you for the question. In the effort of time here, I'll just remind you that Dr. Krupa is running a workshop in the second set of workshops here this afternoon, so certainly you can address some questions, hopefully in that session as well. Thank you, Dr. Krupa.